Hi everybody, and welcome to our last art history video together. This will be the last one in our series. We are looking at video 6, The Artist Speaks, the last couple from our Global Contemporary unit. As before, we have some essential points you can review on your own. But today we're looking at how the artist speaks. We have 3 works. We have The Gates, we have Stadia 2, and we have Sunflower Seeds. And I want you to think about how do artists voice their thoughts, their ideas through visual imagery. And this is a great question for you to be considering now, especially with this last piece for my class, or just when you're thinking about creating art in the future. Think about how a lot of artists, especially contemporary artists, aren't necessarily just making a picture of something in a certain style. They're thinking about their own beliefs, their own ideas, and how to express those in a visual way. So it's using your own voice, finding a way to interpret that into a visual image. So let's start off with The Gates. This is by Christo and Jean-Claude, and sadly, so Jean-Claude is the wife and Christo is the husband. Jean-Claude died many, many years ago. Christo actually just died, I believe it was Saturday night or Sunday morning this past week. So sad. He was 84 though, and he was able to realize many, many projects after his wife's death as well. So let's move on and talk about The Gates in New York City. This was something that, if you look at the date range, they started planning for and trying to get the commission for in 1979, and it was actually realized in February 2005. So it's possible that some of you might have been there or seen it. I did not, but it's pretty neat. This video that I have up here is a link. It's kind of nice because it shows you how to, or it gives you the chance to kind of experience it. So I'm going to see if I can get this to work for a moment. It's kind of a rough video, but it shows somebody skateboarding through. So you get a chance to kind of see what it looks like. If I can get it to go through. Let's just fast forward. This is the construction of it. You can see they were planning all of the beams that came in for the project. There were over 600 workers used to install it, and then they had 300 workers to remove it. So the part that I really want to show you is this. Just the opportunity to kind of see what it was like to actually go through all of the gates and experience it as an individual. Okay, moving on back to our PowerPoint. So one thing that Christo said about the piece was that fabric is like a second skin. It is very related to human existence. That fabric will move with the wind, the water, and with the natural elements. The fabric is moving like breathing. It's so incredibly present. And so fabric is a main element that they use in a lot of their works. Most of them are environmental. They're out in the world, in nature, to specific sites, but they bring in elements of fabric and they feel this connection to fabric as they expressed before. So here's a picture of the couple. They were born in Bulgaria. I'm actually not sure about Jean-Claude, but I know that Christo was born in Bulgaria but lives in the United States, or lived. Using of cloth, the works are usually temporary. They're usually about a couple weeks. This one was 16 days. And they're usually related to environments, whether that be a building or a valley or an island. They use those environments to kind of inspire their works. This particular work cost $21 million to put together. I mentioned how many people were involved in the process. When it comes to money for projects, they would actually raise money beforehand by selling images or small parts related to the planning of it. So I'll show you some sketches, some preliminary sketches. So they would raise all of the money themselves through selling early preliminaries to create these works. The poles were made of vinyl. They were attached to the path using some steel brackets, but they did not make any holes in the ground, so no destruction to the park at all. And there were 7,500 fabric panels. Each of the pieces was 16 feet tall, 12 feet apart, and then the width of them depended on the width of the path. So that's kind of how they determined how wide they would be. So they chose the rectangle as this form because they wanted to reference the city grid. Remember, this is Central Park in the middle of New York City. Very, very famous park, well designed by architect landscape Olmsted in the 19th century. And so he designed this park, and one of the features was there's a stone wall around most of the park. And the openings of the stone wall are something that Olmsted originally called gates. And so that's where Christo and Jean-Claude got this idea to call it the gates, just to kind of reference back to the original artist of the park. And so the whole point of this piece was to strengthen your awareness of the space. So the park is already beautiful. People experience it for exercise, but also there's just so much joy that comes from an outdoor space that's beautifully designed in the middle of a big city. And the goal is to kind of reawaken your experience of this place of nature, to make you feel it in a different way. And the choice in fabric gives some movement and kind of integrates into the landscape a little bit more. So their works try to engage with the nature. They're not trying to confine or contain or change nature. And I mentioned the money and the partnership. They worked together for many, many years. And there was some controversy with this project too, because people thought it was too bright, too geometric, too harsh on the landscape in the city. So at first it did take a while to get the approvals, but eventually Mayor Bloomberg did approve it, and it came to fruition. So here's some examples of initial floor plans, maps, sketches. All of those things would be things they would sell to raise money for this project. And here's just a nice view of what it looked like in the park when they were all up. Just a little bit more. These are two other works of theirs. Here are a couple islands that were surrounded by fabric. Here's an entire building that was covered in fabric. And just one more quote. The temporary quality of the projects is an aesthetic decision. So this is about all of their work. Our works are temporary in order to endow the works of art with a feeling of urgency to be seen, and the love and tenderness brought by the fact that they will not last. Those feelings are usually reserved for other temporary things such as childhood and our own life. These are valued because we know that they will not last. We want to offer this feeling of love and tenderness to our works as an added value or dimension and as an additional aesthetic quality. So the temporary nature is not just because of the place that they're in, but they really want you to have this fleeting moment that you'll have to remember that's got importance to it. All right, our next artist is Giulia Mira, and this is a work called Stadia 2. So when you think stadia, you might be thinking stadium, and that is actually partially some of her influence here, and we'll get to that. But to begin with, the way that she creates her works is she starts with these gridded linear elements. Usually they're black and they're applied first. So you can see there are some kind of going back into space. You can see there are some black linear elements around too that kind of curve back and forth. And so by putting these grids in, she's kind of creating a space that is deeper than just the flat picture plane. It looks like this is a floor you could walk into. The lines that are closer and kind of curved in the background are making us think possibly some kind of stadium, some kind of big place where there might be pews in the back or there might be seating, and then in the front there's this big open space. So those would be applied first. Her canvases, by the way, are massive. I'll show you a picture of her next to them. Usually they're multi-stories tall, hundreds of feet wide, huge. So anyway, this work, she then starts to add flat colored shapes. We see some really ashy marks if I zoom in. And so in between different layers of her work, she puts on like a clear coat, almost like a glossy, waxy finish, so that she has different depths of things that sit at different depths on the canvas. So this is a way that she can create layers and create a history in the piece, which kind of is a symbolic choice. So she wants there to be earlier areas and then things that are added on top of and on top of, so you can kind of see things below the surface. So for content, she's using architecture, grids from cities, maps as kind of a starting point, but then she adds a lot of colors and shapes that are very abstracted and simplified, but they might reference certain things for you. So for instance, if we go up near the top here, you might see elements up here that maybe remind you of a flag. You might see some repeated triangles here that look like flags that you might see in a sporting arena. So flags are an element that she's utilizing. Sometimes it's picket signs, so you might see some rectangles that are kind of held up at different angles, so they reference picketing. And then smaller dots, smaller details reference people. We see this kind of ashy, quick, linear elements that are just a little bit more textured. Those are supposed to be explosions, smoke, more movement, more of a fleeting thing than some of the more solid shapes. And then the layering I mentioned, it's to give the piece a little bit more of a history. All right, so here is Julie. She was born in Ethiopia, but does live in New York City, and she does a lot of work in New York City. So her pieces are about referencing gatherings of people. So you can think of big sporting events, big art events, music arenas, all the times that a lot of people come together. But then you can also think of things that are a little less planned, such as if you think about riots, if you think about protests, if you think about war. These are events where lots of people come together and there's a lot of energy and a lot of chaos. And sometimes it can be a dark kind of chaos, and sometimes it can be a really bright, positive chaos. So her goal is to highlight movement and the speed of the world changing. Right now, if you try to encapsulate our world and our society in one piece, think about how outdated that might be in a week, a month, a year, especially now with all of the things going on. And so her work is so abstract that it can speak to the chaos in our current society, but in a way that will not become outdated because the shapes are so abstracted. She's trying to keep it vague enough that the interpretation can stay open. So sometimes her works are focused on nationalism and revolution, as I mentioned, coming together for positive things, coming together for change. And she uses abstraction and symbolism to speak broadly about politics, history, and changing present. So her work always stays very abstracted. Sometimes the elements in the grids are much more streamlined. Sometimes there's a lot more of the smoke and those more gray, quick moving rhythmic elements. Really just depends what her focus is for those specific pieces. And so we have a few more here. I'm just going to read a little bit of this quote. The earlier, more analytic impulse for her art was to use very rational but kind of absurd techniques and tendencies, mapping, charting, and architecture, to try and make sense of who I was in my time and space and political environment. But there's only so much truth to a theoretical understanding of something. The action or behavior, or what happens organically or intuitively, rationally and spiritually, or majestically, in a world is a very different thing than what can happen in our effort to understand it. So she's talking about this broadness and something that's a little more psychological, a little bigger than like one specific event, one specific protest or riot. Instead, she's trying to get at something that's a little bit deeper in what she works on. So here are a couple more of her pieces. This one has a lot of these kind of gray blockier elements. It's got a lot of elements that kind of look like a city if you were looking from a tall building. This one, she's got tons and tons of those grid lines in the back. And then here's just to show you the scale of what she works on. These pieces are massive. She's pretty much always working at a very, very large scale. All right, moving on to our last artist. I love that we close with Weiwei. He's one of my favorites. And this piece is called Sunflower Seeds. So you can see this is actually the same gallery in the Tate Modern in London that Doris Salcedo's Shibboleth was in. And what you might notice is we have this view sitting on the ground. There's all these sunflower seeds at the bottom of it. So let's move on and look a little bit closer at this piece. Okay, so first of all, these pieces, they look like sunflower seeds, but they're actually made of porcelain, and they're hand painted and hand sculpted. So there are over 100 million of these in the space for this gallery exhibition. The people that hand formed them and hand painted them are in a workshop in China, in the specific city where porcelain was really developed, and then also it became the city known for all imperial porcelain assignments. And so there's this long-standing history and tradition of porcelain in this community related to the government, and then related also just to the history of porcelain. And so he has multiple small workshops working on this. Think of it as a kind of mix of mass production, because we're making 100 million seeds, but also there's this handcrafted tradition where people are working individually on every single one. And remember, since these are ceramic, they're not only made in clay and then fired in the kiln, but then they have to be painted again, well, glazed, and then they have to be fired again. So we're talking about an extremely rigorous process to create all of these seeds. So why in the world sunflower seeds? Well, Ai Weiwei is a Chinese artist, and sunflower seeds are really important and symbolic in his culture, his background, and his experience as a Chinese individual. So they're a common snack that people snack on a lot in China. It's also something that when friends gather, you share your sunflower seeds with your friend. It's a way to kind of connect to one another. There's also a little bit of a darker side to it, which relates to Mao's Cultural Revolution, which Ai Weiwei was alive and living during that time, and so he experienced it. And basically Mao, a lot of the imagery from the Cultural Revolution shows Mao as the sun, and then shows the people as the sunflowers looking on to him. They need him for support. He's giving them light, so the sunflowers all turn to him. And here's just two examples to kind of show you how that was shown. And remember, during the Cultural Revolution, it was a time where there was a lot of poverty, a lot of uncertainty. People in the countryside were going broke, didn't have enough food, and so it was a really, really rough time for a lot of people. But because of propaganda, it was shown in the artwork, it was shown as a time of great prosperity. And so he's kind of referencing this time, and sunflower seeds reference the sunflowers and this dark history in the government in China. Also, sunflower seeds during that time were shown as a kindness or a compassion to share with people because of the darkness and the poverty at the time. So here's Ai Weiwei at the exhibition. He was able to attend briefly, but then something happened, which we'll go over. And here you can see people were actually able to walk on the work. They were able to sit down, hold the work in their hands, really experience it the way that you would experience sunflower seeds if you were eating them. You'd have them in your hands, you'd feel them as you were eating them. So the function of this work, and a lot of his works, is about the individual, you as one person, and then about the mass as a whole. So he purposely makes the sunflower seeds really, really unique. So every single one's a little different, but then when you put them together, it's masses. And so he's talking about how when people stand together, when they come together, their voice can be heard, they can stand up together and make change. So he's looking at freedom, he's trying to voice injustices in society, both political and social. Ai Weiwei refers to himself as a ready-made. If you think of Duchamp with his ready-mades, this is kind of a nod to him. He fuses his life with his art, so he's basically giving his art his life in a way that has actually gotten him into trouble in China many times. And he does this to advocate for individual freedoms and responsibilities of people who maybe cannot advocate for themselves. So all of his works were created, I talked about that already. There's also kind of a nod to this made in China idea, right? We kind of make fun of the fact that so much of the stuff that we have has this made in China sticker or stamp on it. And a lot of it is just mass-produced plastic items, but here we have more individual pieces. So during this exhibition, the artist was actually detained in China for 81 days. A lot of his work is so controversial and speaks out against his own government, and so he has been exiled several times because of it. Okay, just a couple more works by him because he is such an active artist in our community today. So these ones I've actually seen. These were Lego portraits. In the same way sunflower seeds are very individual, but together they make up something bigger. He used Legos in the same way. There's this one element, but when you put them together, you can make all of these portraits. And so all of these pictures are of different political dissidents, different people who have spoken out against governments or have political beliefs or are helping underprivileged people around the world, and they are all being detained. So in addition to looking at their pictures created out of Legos, in this exhibit there are monitors around, and you can click on the person in the picture and you can learn about why they are imprisoned, where they are imprisoned, and how long. So it's kind of trying to make us connect with the fact that there are a lot of people behind bars being held for the good work that they've done. The second work I'm going to highlight here has to do with refugees. So if you notice, there's a large boat. We have all of these blown up kind of beings, and then we also have a lot over here as well, all with their kind of life vests. So he's getting you to think about the refugee crisis around the world, and how many people are actually influenced and in trouble because of this crisis. All right, so those are our artists. We finished. Just a couple things. Our final assessment, there's a document in Schoology that you can look at for this. We're not going to have a traditional test for this. I wanted it to be something deeper where you could reflect on the artists and the work that they're doing in our world today. So I really want to hear your reactions. So you're going to choose 3 artists from all of the ones that we have looked at. And then you're going to use 3 prompts to write about the artists and your reactions, opinions, reflections. So the prompts are like, if I could have coffee with one artist, this is the artist I'd want to have coffee with. Or if I could own one work of art, this is the one work of art I would want to own. And so you're answering that question, but you're also saying why. So why did it make such an impact on you? What would you hope to get out of that meeting? So you'll describe the work and the artist, a little bit of kind of a recap, why you chose it for the prompt, and you're basically writing a paragraph for each artist explaining your feelings related to the work. 3 paragraphs, a chance for you to be reflective in a narrative style, and it'll be due on Friday, June 12th. All right, if you have any questions, you need any help, I am here for you guys. Looking forward to seeing your artwork and reading your assessments.